everyone, how's it going? Matthew Bailey Media here, and welcome once again to another tier list video. And as you can tell by the title of the video, this is going to be my tier list of all of the DreamWorks movies that have come out so far this year. The most recent one I saw was Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken, which will be on this list. Now, and there are quite a few movies that I have described in the video that I have not seen or whatever. There's quite a few of them. I actually think I have just as many movies I haven't seen that I have in one specific tier list. You'll see what I'm referring to once I get into this video. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into this. Hey guys, so welcome to my DreamWorks tier list, and as you can see, I've still got it pretty much set up the same way I did for my $1 billion movies. I got the S tier, which are the really great ones, A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier, F tier, and I do have a haven't seen category because there are a few of these DreamWorks movies that you may find surprising that I actually have not seen. But anyways, without further ado, let's get started with the very first movie, Puss in Boots. Now, this is the first spin-off to the Shrek franchise, and I will say it did kind of make me a little relieved to see how they sort of introduced his origin story in a way in this first Puss in Boots film, and we did get to see a little bit of what he was doing before when you look at everything that happened during the beginning of the movie, where it shows like how he grew up and when he was forced to be on the run. That moment was apparently when he met Shrek and was hired to kill the ogre. And so this kind of serves as an aftermath, a prequel / aftermath of what happened during the events of Shrek 2, 3, and 4, I guess, in a way. And I will say, I do like Antonio Banderas in the role, and it's nice that they introduced a new character in Kitty Sawpaws, and she also kind of serves as his little love interest in a way. And we'll talk about her being his love interest in when we get to the sequel. But for the first movie, I thought it was an okay film. I mean, the villain was kind of a little not as popular as I wanted to be, but I will say I will probably put it in the C tier. I mean, it was a good film, and I definitely think it has some flaws when it comes to like the villain and some of the things that happened in the film. But aside from that, I do love that they created a little spin-off for the Shrek characters. So next up, we got Kung Fu Panda 2. So this is the second film, whatever. I'm going to talk about the first and third film in a little bit, but when it comes to the second film, I will say I love all the Kung Fu Panda movies. I will say Jack Black as the titular character is so good. I mean, but when you look at all three movies, when it comes to the second one, there was a lot of character development when it comes to Po, and especially, you may find this a little shocking, but this movie kind of not only shows how well Po and Tigress have become such good friends, but there's been a fan theory going out there like crazy, and it kind of was hinted at in the third movie too, but when it comes to the second movie, they say in this movie is when they hinted at not only did Po and Tigress become such good friends and respect each other, but it seems like Tigress sort of may have a thing for Po romantically, and they could become a couple if they ever create another movie. That I think would be an interesting dilemma. I mean, it's just like with Zootopia, where they have Judy Hopps, who's a bunny, and Nick Wilde, who's a fox, being a possible couple in the future, and I gotta say, that is really surprising. But again, the villain of this movie really drives Poe's character development, and I love that they did that. So I'm actually going to put this one in the S tier. I really enjoyed how well they made that story arc and his development as a character in this movie. Now we move to the first Kung Fu Panda movie. And again, this is where we get introduced to Po and how he's sort of a fanboy of the Furious Five and Kung Fu, and when he's revealed to be the Dragon Warrior, he's okay with it, and he's just goofing around with the Furious Five. But then unfortunately, the person who chose Po dies, and his protege Shifu finally lives up to what he's been told to do and believe that Po can be the true Dragon Warrior. And I gotta say, I love that this is how they started his little character development arc in the first 3 movies so far. And again, there is a 4th Kung Fu Panda coming out sometime next year, so we'll see how well that one does. But in regards to this one, Ian McShane as Tai Lung, he was a decent villain too. And I gotta say, when you look at all the movies that DreamWorks has done in the past, Kung Fu Panda, of course, is like one of the few franchises that are like so good when it comes to the DreamWorks properties. Now we move on to Turbo. About the one thing, I honestly didn't get why they even made this movie. I mean, it really makes no sense why they think a snail suddenly gain a bunch of speedy powers and racing in the NASCAR or something would make a good story plot. I mean, it was still somewhat entertaining, but I still think it was not like the worst movie that they ever made. I think there is one movie on here that I guarantee a lot of people will agree with me that was like, why did they make this movie? But now let's move on to Trolls. Now, Trolls is the first movie that I think even does like a singing, mostly singing in the whole movie, and it introduces us to Poppy and Branch, who sort of not only develop a friendship with each other, but they also start to feel a little bit of romantic feelings toward each other. And gotta say, I'm really excited for how the future holds, especially when it comes to the third movie. Now, unfortunately, the third movie has not come out yet, and I noticed that it is on this list, so I'm probably going to put it under haven't seen. But anyways, with the first Trolls, I think it was okay. It wasn't as good as Puss in Boots, but I still think it was a decent film. Next up is Spirit. Now, this movie is the only 2D, is one of the few 2D movies that they ever made. And this is one that I have seen, at least when it comes to the 2D movies. And I gotta say, I love how they portrayed this horse as being untamable, and having him realize that he can do whatever he wants, and I love the way they told this story. I think it's definitely one of the better films that belong in the A tier, for sure. And I love that about it. Next up is Shrek Forever After. Now we're slowly making our way back down the Shrek movies. We're starting with the 4th movie, Shrek Forever After. Now, this is the one movie that sequel to Shrek that I will say, I think it's a lot better than the first Puss in Boots, but I think it still has its flaws in a way. Like it's like he has this family, and it's funny because I don't know if anybody realized this, but there's a scene in the movie where they basically are going to the kid's birthday party, and as he's trying to unfold a stroller, a bunch of villagers come up to him, and it's funny because it seems like the villagers who come up to him are the same guys who were from the first movie that tried to attack him in his swamp when he was alone. And I think that was a weird way to bring them back and sort of push the plot through as to why he's not very happy and he wants things to go back to the way they were. I will say it's nice. It was kind of cool to see like sort of a retelling of Shrek meeting Fiona and trying to get her to fall in love with him. But I will say they really did Puss in Boots dirty in this movie, especially in the alternate universe where it's like where he let himself go a lot during retirement in that alternate dimension, and I gotta say that was just weird. But I will say it's definitely better than the first Puss in Boots movie, but it still deserves to be in the C tier. Next up is Shrek the Third. Now, even though this was the movie to introduce Shrek and Fiona's kids, or letting them know that they were pregnant, I will say this is one of those movies that, yeah, I actually would take Turbo over Shrek the Third, because this is the one movie that it really started to go down in quality, especially where the one thing that I didn't get with them introducing in this movie was a castle that apparently served as a high school for like for young people, and I'm like, there's no way that existed in it, that would ever exist in this type of world. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't think this movie did well. Next up is Shrek 2. Now this is the one sequel that, to me, I can't believe I'm saying this, but this actually was like one of the better sequels when it comes to the main franchises that are part of this universe. And I loved Shrek 2. I mean, it was really a nice way to introduce Fiona and Shrek's main love story and trying to get their blessing from Fiona's parents. And it's, again, just like the first movie, it introduced a character that normally people would depict as a good person who's been featured in Disney projects before, and then in this movie she turns out being evil. I will say there are a few movies that kind of do that in this. A lot of these DreamWorks movies end up mimicking Disney characters and turning them that are heroes, but then they turn them into bad guys, which I think is just weird that they did that. But I think Fairy Godmother and Prince Charming being the villains of this movie was kind of fun. And now we move on to the first Shrek movie, which, of course, you know that this movie is like one of the, just like the second movie, it's like one of the few movies I really enjoyed. I mean, you have 3 different franchises in here that people seem to really enjoy more than others, and that's the Kung Fu Panda, the Shrek, and once we get to it, the How to Train Your Dragon movies. Those are like the 3 franchises that have more than 2 installments that people seem to really enjoy. There is another franchise in here, which is the Madagascar franchise, but it's not as beloved as the other ones. And I kind of agree with them. Next up is Rise of the Guardians. Now, you may find this as quite a surprise, but this is one of those movies that unfortunately I have not seen. I still need to watch it at some point in the near future, but I'll probably get to it next. Once Trolls Band Together comes out, which is Trolls 3, I'll probably try to find all these other movies I haven't seen from DreamWorks and watch them. So, next up is Penguins of Madagascar. Now, this is the first spin-off movie that takes place after the first 3 Madagascar movies, and kind of a prequel to them as well. And I will say this is one of those spin-off movies that I didn't quite get, like why they decided to solely focus on these characters. And I will say I definitely think it's not a bad movie that deserves to be below C tier, but I think, yeah, I will say it's probably better than the first Trolls in my opinion, but I still think it was like not something I would rewatch too much. Next up is Mr. Peabody and Sherman. Now, apparently there was like a TV series that this was based on, and I just never watched those shows. But when I saw this movie, I thought it was interesting to see the concept of time travel and inventing a time machine and a dog being the parent of a young boy. And I will say it was nice to see some of the historical things that happened, but then by the end of the movie, the historical figures sort of bring back things from the past, which kind of ruin the space-time continuum in a way. And I will say, I still think it's a okay film. I don't think it's better than the Puss in Boots movie or Shrek Forever After. If I had to say, I probably will take Trolls or Penguins of Madagascar over this, but not Trolls. I still think it's better than Trolls, unfortunately. Next up is Monsters vs. Aliens. Now, this is a movie that, unfortunately, I don't know why they created this movie. I mean, just like with Turbo, it just made no sense with the way the plot was going. And, I mean, I will say some of the characters were interesting. Specifically, Susan. She was the only character that really had a growth in character. And I will say, the villain, I didn't get what why he had the motives that he did. I will say, though, that I do think it's better than Turbo, in my opinion, because it was, again, I get some of the story plots for this, but I still think it made no sense. And the same thing goes for Turbo, but anyways, next up we have Megamind. Now, this is an interesting type of story being told in this movie. It's the story of a young bluish alien named who he calls himself Megamind, and his planet was being destroyed, and he's sent off to Earth by his parents. But unfortunately, there was another kid in a different planet whose parents had the same idea, and then they formed this weird rivalry between each other when they got to Earth. Unfortunately, Megamind was gonna become part of a rich family, but unfortunately, he got knocked into a prison that these prisoners tried to teach him bad and good, and how good is wrong and bad is good and all that sort of stuff. But the way that the main twist of this whole movie is I can't believe they tried to. There's a reason why the movie was called Megamind. Is because they basically turn him from this bad guy who's constantly trying to have a hero to fight against to becoming a good guy and actually falling in love and realizing the error in his ways. And I really love the way they told this story. I didn't think it was better than the Shrek movie, so I'm probably just going to put it here in B tier. I definitely think it was a interesting concept. Next up is Madagascar 3, Europe's Most Wanted. Now, before I get to the other Madagascar movies, I will say this is the one movie that actually did not feature one specific character that showed up in the first two movies. That I think there was a reason why so many people loved the first two movies, and that's because of that character. But I will say that there is one character that kind of that made up for the one character's absence from the first two movies. And the one character I'm referring to that was in the first two movies is this old lady who kept referring to Alex the lion as a bad kitty. And unfortunately she was not in this third movie, but they did make up for it with the main villain of the third film, Chantal Dubois, in Monte Carlo. And I think it's interesting, to say the least, and plus this is supposed to be like the conclusion of their story arc, and when they first went to Madagascar, then they went to Africa, and then they met these young animals in the circus that they realized that they never felt so alive, and just sitting there in the zoo was not so much fun anymore. And I will say that I love the way they told this story. It was basically a way of concluding their chapter as characters, from being zoo animals to circus performers, and where they travel the world like they did throughout all three movies. And I will say, I think it was definitely a really entertaining watch in a way. So I think it's probably just behind Megamind, in my opinion. I love how they portrayed these characters. Next up, we got Kung Fu Panda 3. Now, at first I thought this was going to be the last movie, but it sounds like they are making a fourth movie and maybe even a fifth movie. It does, because the fourth movie's plot actually sounds interesting, and I'm curious how they're going to end it. But with this movie, it's nice to see that Po reconnects with his biological father, who we all thought was dead after the second movie. And the villain of this movie is actually connected to why Po was chosen to become the Dragon Warrior. And that is a pretty great way to end, to tie everything together and why Oogway chose him. And he learns a lot over the course of this movie. And I really am excited for the fourth movie, and hopefully it doesn't get ruined by the recent trend of what's been going on with most movies. Now, I will say, though, that it doesn't seem like all the DreamWorks movies that have come out recently have been like that, but I will say Kung Fu Panda 3 is one of those. The Kung Fu Panda series in general, I mean, I will say I will take this one over the first Kung Fu Panda, but I still think all three Kung Fu Panda movies are like one of the best films of the entire DreamWorks franchise. All three movies, the Kung Fu Panda trilogy, I feel like is what kick-started, is what really made DreamWorks successful. And now we're about to move on to another franchise that kind of became really popular, and with the second How to Train Your Dragon movie. Now, this movie is, I will say, this is a movie that I thought was interesting. It basically introduced us to newer characters from the franchise, like Hiccup's mother, who is revealed to still be alive. We get introduced to a villain that I actually love the villain of this movie. And he's one of the few villains who really understands who knows what he's talking about when it comes to trying to however, he wants to rise above the fear of dragons, and I get that, but unfortunately, his motives as to why he wanted to conquer other lands by controlling those who follow him, honestly, it's a really interesting story, and this is the one movie that has him become chief of his tribe, unfortunately, because, spoiler alert, his father dies in this movie, and I think the way that they portray him becoming chief after his father's untimely death really shows you how Hiccup was born to be the leader he was. And I will say this is one of those, just like the Kung Fu Panda franchise, I definitely think it's on par as one of the greater trilogies of all time. And I definitely feel like they should try to continue. They're already continuing with Kung Fu Panda, but I kind of want to see if they would create a sequel trilogy in a way that not only brings back the characters of Hiccup and Astrid and all that, but who knows, they could bring back, but then they can make a time jump go by where they have their kids be the main stars of the new trilogy, and I kind of want to see where they would lead into that, because this series is great. Anyways, let's move on to Home. Now, this is a DreamWorks movie that, honestly, I feel like this is probably on par. It's not just in the D tier, but I think it's just above it, behind Trolls. I mean, I think it's an interesting concept, and I will say that song at the end, where near the end of the movie, after O becomes a hero and and Tip is trying to find her mother and realizing that the bond they had together. I mean, I thought it was an okay story, but it's not as good as Trolls was when that movie came out. Next up, we got The Croods. Now, this is an interesting story because it sort of introduces the cave people's perception of of not only trying to live, but to explore during their lives and not just be cooped up all the time. Especially with the characters of Eep and Guy. And again, Ryan Reynolds is amazing as the character. I mean, I think this is one of the few movies that Ryan Reynolds first appeared in that really kick-started him into stardom. And I gotta say, I do love the way they portrayed this story. I will talk about the sequel later on, but when it comes to the first movie, this one definitely deserves to be in like the B tier. Because it was definitely a compelling story in a way. Next up is Captain Underpants, the first epic movie. Now, you guys may find this shocking, but just like before with Rise of the Guardians, this is another movie that I have not seen. It's mainly because I didn't grow up reading the books, unfortunately, so I don't know. I wouldn't really need to watch the movie. But like I said, there's more movies to come on the haven't seen list, unfortunately. One of them obviously makes sense because it hasn't come out yet, but yeah, there's quite a few after that. Next up, we got The Boss Baby. Now, I will say this is a movie that I really did not get when it first came out. I mean, the plot and the way that they were and the motives of the villain, I didn't really get it. But I mean, I will say it was definitely much more entertaining though than these three movies. Unfortunately, that's why it's in the D tier. But I just didn't understand it. I really didn't. Next up is Madagascar Escape to Africa. I love the way they did that little title merger. Again, this is definitely an interesting film because, like the third movie, it actually, the reason why it's called Escape to Africa is because we do get a huge reveal as to why Alex the lion was in the zoo to begin with, and why he only knows the iconic dance routine that he tries to do, and that whole roar thing that he does, and why he was so fixated on trying to get back to the zoo, because it was the only thing he knew how to do. And in this movie, we get introduced to the realization that Alex's parents are from Africa, and he's actually the son of the king of Africa, and when it comes to the lions, and I think that's interesting. And I love the little dynamic between his father and him, and how his father finally learns to accept him for who he is. And I will say, this is, since I just talked about The Boss Baby, it's funny how not necessarily the villain of The Boss Baby, but one of the main characters that drove the story, that sort of acted like a bad guy at first, was voiced by this guy named Alec Baldwin, and it turns out that's who was voicing the villain in Madagascar 2. Now, I will say, I definitely do find it better than these. I don't think it's as good as the third movie, but I still think it's relatively a good film. Again, you look at all the franchises that are out there: How to Train Your Dragon, Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda. These are all franchises that came out that people really enjoyed. And it's ironic that most of these franchises came out between the mid 2000s and the late 2010s. Literally, I think you got 14 years, a 14-year time span of all three of these franchises: Kung Fu Panda, How to Train Your Dragon, and Madagascar. so that was like the better time for DreamWorks films, in my opinion. All right, so now we get to the first Madagascar. Again, was an interesting concept when they first made this movie, but again, just like this one, I think it's not as good as the first or the second and third movies, but I still think it was a relatively fun watch in a way. Next up is the first How to Train Your Dragon movie. Now, this one is definitely an interesting movie because it was the first movie in the trilogy. It introduced us to Hiccup and how he was at first when he was this little nobody who people thought was like a bad omen. And then when by the end of the movie he fully changes his dad and everybody in the village's minds about dragons, and he actually is able to keep his pet dragon toothless. And he also finally gets his first girlfriend, which I will talk about that little story arc when we get to the third movie. But with the first movie, I definitely think it's on par with just like with this one, it's on par. Now, next up is B movie. Honestly, I didn't get this movie. Just like with Monsters vs. Aliens and Turbo, I didn't get why this movie was even a thing. The way that the story plots that they were coming up with in this movie made no sense. But I will say it's definitely better than all three of these, but it's not as good as The Boss Baby. I still think, like I said, you look at all of these movies didn't really make a lot of sense when it comes to their story plots. Next up, we got How to Train Your Dragon 3: The Hidden World. Now, this is the conclusion to this this trilogy of How to Train Your Dragon, and the villain of this movie, Grimmel the Grizzly, it's revealed that there's a reason why the Night Fury, why there was only one Night Fury in the first How to Train Your Dragon. Is because he had tried killing all the Night Furies. And now I will say his motives as to going after Chief Hiccup and the Isle of Berg and all the dragons makes more sense, because he even says to Hiccup that Hiccup's father, Stoic, had it right to make it his mission to get rid of the dragons so he could live in a better world. Not necessarily the whole motive, but he thinks that it would make more sense if he grew up in a world where dragons and humans did not coexist and live together in peace. And I will say, but just like the first movie, when he realizes how much he screwed up, his girlfriend in this franchise, Astrid, finally makes him realize that he is the one of the best, stubbornest people that she knows, and that his dragon Toothless didn't give him that. He just made it easier for him to grow as a character. And I love how by the end of the movie they get married. It was a really good story of how at first they hated each other, then they started to get into a dating thing, and then by the third movie they get married, they have kids. And I still think that if they were to continue the franchise, they should do like a sequel trilogy in a way, kind of like Star Wars, where they basically have the kids of Astrid and Hiccup actually be the new main characters. Like, I'm curious if they will consider that. Right now, the rumor is that they're creating a live-action remake of this trilogy, which I do not get. Why can't they just do a normal animated sequel series? That would make more sense. But this movie, I definitely feel like it was better than both of the other movies, because it was the conclusion to the entire trilogy. And as you can clearly tell, I loved the Kung Fu Panda and the How to Train Your Dragon trilogies. They were like one of the better series where every single installment was like the best of the bunch. Now we move on to Over the Hedge. Again, this is another movie that, like B movie, Monsters vs. Aliens, and Turbo, I didn't get what was the point of it. However, someone did point out that that the character of Hemi, the little squirrel, there was a moment in the movie where he's in like a slow motion form and everybody else is like frozen. But it's revealed that this movie was actually released before that very first Quicksilver scene that we got in Days of Future Past, and they're saying that he was the first one to actually do that Quicksilver movement. So really, he holds that title of the first slow motion, hyperactive character scene where he's moving faster than everybody else. But aside from that, this movie did not really make any sense. I will say I definitely take it over Monsters vs. Aliens and Turbo when it comes to these original movies, but I think B-Movie's definitely a little better than it, but not that good. Next up, we got Shark Tale. Yeah, this is finally the first movie, in my opinion, to go... yeah, that... I did not understand what the point... I swear to you, this movie is like one of the few DreamWorks movies that most people have nightmares over. With Will Smith's face, and it seems like the way that they were speaking their lines behind the scenes it seems like it was more entertaining than what we actually got in the animation form. It just made no sense. Alright, next up is something called Sinbad. Now, of course, like Rise of the Guardians and Captain Underpants, I have not seen this movie, unfortunately. We got quite a few more movies left on here that I haven't seen, unfortunately, but we'll get to those in a little bit. Next up is Abominable. Now, this is a movie that came out roughly right before the pandemic hit that not many people went to see, and that's mainly because at the time you had movies like Joker, It Chapter 2, the Jumanji, The Next Level, just to name a few movies that came out during the fall season, because this came out in the fall, and it was overshadowed by a lot of these other movies. I will say that, and plus this is the only movie from DreamWorks that was actually made under another studio combined with them, and I don't know exactly what it was, but I will say I thought it was a compelling story. But the reason why, if y'all remember earlier, I said that during the Shrek movies, I said that they took Disney characters and turned them into bad guys in a way. Some people compared the villain, the twist villain in this movie, who was a young woman who looked like the princess Merida from Brave. They basically took her and made her a villainous character in this movie. Like, that is the one thing I didn't get. I will say I definitely found it really much more enjoyable to watch than all these movies in the C tier, but it definitely was not too great, but not too bad either. Now we move on to Ants, and of course this came out at a time when Disney and DreamWorks were definitely trying to make where I think right around the time this movie came out, they also released from Pixar A Bug's Life, which is pretty much the same, almost exactly the same story, but this one didn't include the grasshoppers, and it included another angry ant that was a bad guy. This, just like most movies, I will say I definitely will take this over Shark Tale, but it was not one of the better films in my mind. Especially when it's revealed how far away this paradise that the character was being told about wasn't even that far, but it just looked like that. From their perspective, it just didn't make sense. Next up is Trolls World Tour. Now, this movie is the sequel to the first Trolls, and I will say I actually did kind of like this better than the first movie. In fact, I liked it so much better that I'd probably just put it right over it. It definitely wasn't as good as all these other movies, but I still think this movie was definitely better. It was a much better quality and better storytelling than the first movie. And there's a reason why nobody really liked the first Trolls movie, and it's because of the evil characters that were featured in there. Now, it sounds like they're gonna bring back those characters in the third movie once it comes out, but unfortunately, I'm probably but I don't think they're going to be as much of a focus as they were in the first movie. So hopefully the third movie ends up being better than the first. But now we got Flushed Away. Now, I will say this, just like with a lot of the movies in the D tier, this one is something that I didn't quite understand at first, but I will say I actually find it just on par with B movie, I should say. I definitely will take B movie over it, but it still is like one of those movies that I didn't quite understand what was the point of it. Next up, we got Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit. Again, this is another movie that unfortunately I have not seen. And now we got quite a few other movies that I have not seen on this list, like Chicken Run, unfortunately. And I heard there is a sequel coming out, so I need to maybe watch this eventually. And there's also Prince of Egypt I haven't seen, El Dorado I haven't seen. Yeah, these are a lot of movies I have not seen, unfortunately. But next up, we got Croods: A New Age. Now, this is the sequel to the first Croods, and again, I put the first Croods in the B tier because I thought it was really good. Unfortunately, the second movie kind of became like a downgrade. I mean, it wasn't too bad. I will say I definitely will take it over the Boss Baby 1. I may just put it right here behind Home in the C tier. I thought it was not too bad, but it still could have had been a huge improvement. Next up is Spirit Untamed. Now, if you guys remember, I think this was 2 years ago, I made a video with my cousin Tyler Bailey. Go check out that video. But me and him both saw Spirit Untamed, and I will say this was a huge downgrade from the first Spirit movie. I mean, the animation clearly was different, and apparently this was not necessarily a sequel per se, but it was sort of a movie-ish version of a TV series that came out on Netflix, and the animation in here was definitely better than what we got in the Netflix series, but I still think it made no sense to consider this a sequel. Some people are saying that the horse we see in this movie is actually the son of the original horse, and that's why they consider it a sequel, but I don't know, it just made no sense how they did this. And I didn't think it was that bad. I will say, if I had to put it somewhere in the D tier, I'd probably put it just above these. It's not too bad. These ones are probably worse than this one, in my opinion, but I just didn't quite get why it went from a great movie down to D tier for the sequel. Next up, we got Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Now, this may come as quite a shock, but this is one of the first spin-off sequel movies in the Shrek franchise that, in my opinion, it surpasses the first two Shrek movies. Yeah, it was clearly a huge improvement from the first Shrek, or from the first Puss in Boots movie, but I just cannot believe at how great this movie turned out to be. It was a worthy sequel. The animation was amazing. The character development was so much better. But we're about to get into another DreamWorks movie that ends up telling a decent story. And that's The Bad Guys. Just like with Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, this movie came out at roughly the same time. And this may come as quite a surprise to you guys, but I actually like this movie more than the Shrek movie, first two Shreks. Again, last year was a pretty big year for DreamWorks. Like, they had really good films. Now, I have one more movie that came out in 2021. Like, the only other one that came out in 2021 was Spirit Untamed. But next we got The Boss Baby Family Business, which was the sequel to the first Boss Baby. And I will say, I actually kind of liked this one a little bit more, but I still don't think it was as good as I would like it to be. And I will say, you had The Boss Baby Family Business and Spirit Untamed, both of which came out in 2021, and both ended up being not so good. Then you had 2022, where you had Bad Guys and Puss in Boots. Two really great films. Now we're about to get into our first DreamWorks movie that came out this year that I have seen recently, and that's Ruby Gillman: Teenage Kraken. Now, I will say, this movie, I think it was definitely a downgrade from what we got last year with The Bad Guys and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. But I didn't think it was that bad of a film. And again, I will say I do understand why some people compared the villain of this movie to The Little Mermaid, which this was basically DreamWorks still saying, "Screw you, Disney. You did not like what we did with the characters, and so." Because apparently the guy who was the head of DreamWorks at the time was trying so hard to put certain storylines out there, and they ended up turning them down. And I will say some projects that came out from Disney were still great. I may do the Disney animation films soon for another tier list video, but with this movie, I think it was an interesting concept to flip the characters of a mermaid being the bad guy and being the good guy, and a kraken monster being the bad guy, and flipping it in this movie to where the kraken monster is a good character and the mermaid is the narcissist bad person. Again, I just think it was an interesting concept. I definitely find it better than what we got with the Boss Baby Family Business. In fact, I would actually say it's better than both Trolls movies, Home and The Cruise of New Age. I still prefer these movies over it, but I still think it was a relatively good film. It's like maybe it's, as you can see, it's kind of in the middle with the good films. And then we got 2 more movies out of the 3 that I have not seen, unfortunately. One of those being this Troll Hunters movie. And actually all 3 of these movies I haven't seen. Yeah, see, the last 3 movies on this list I have not seen, mainly because this one hasn't even come out yet, and these 2 I have not seen. So, yep, that is my list for all the DreamWorks movies and how I rank them. And as you can clearly see, I think I have most of the movies in the C tier, and then and also D tier. I have basically 2 trilogies all together in the successful tier because I really enjoyed them. I also got I got 3 out of 6 projects in the Shrek universe in my A tier. I got 1 decent DreamWorks movie with The Bad Guys and Spirit, which is one of the only 2D movies that they had that I really enjoyed. So that's all for now in this DreamWorks tier list video. Hope you guys enjoy it, and just keep an eye out for whatever I decide to do on my next video. So anyways, I will see all you guys in the next video.